Part 1. The Silver Ribbon. The marble foyer of the Sterling Manor echoed with the brittle, high-pitched laughter of high society. Crystal chandeliers cascaded light over designer silk gowns, tailored Italian suits, and a sea of faces that glittered with cold, calculated ambition. It was the 60th birthday celebration of Arthur Sterling, the patriarch of Sterling Enterprises, a man whose name commanded billions in global real estate and shipping. Amidst the sea of wealth stood Clara Sterling, Arthur's daughter-in-law. Clad in a custom emerald green Versace gown that hugged her slender frame, Clara's face was a masterclass in haughty perfection. Her blonde hair was swept into an intricate chignon, and diamond earrings flashed under the lights every time she tossed her head in feigned amusement. To the room, she was the epitome of grace and modern aristocracy. To the domestic staff who tiptoed around her, she was a living nightmare. Near the grand staircase, standing quietly against the mahogany wainscoting, was Elena. Elena wore a plain, stiff black dress with a crisp white collar, the mandatory uniform for the estate's senior housekeepers. Her hands, calloused from decades of scrubbing floors, polishing silver, and tending to ungrateful people, were clasped tightly in front of her. At 58, Elena's back was slightly curved, a physical testament to a life of relentless labor. She had spent the last 25 years working for the Sterlings. She had watched Arthur build his empire, watched his late wife pass away, and watched Clara marry into the family like a sleek cat claiming a warm hearth. Elena held a small, unassuming package wrapped in faded brown butcher paper and tied with a frayed piece of silver ribbon. For the past week, Elena had debated whether she should even give it to him. Arthur Sterling was a billionaire who owned private islands, vintage sports cars, and priceless art. What could a poor housekeeper possibly give a man who had everything? But Arthur was different from the rest of them. While Clara treated the staff like invisible dirt, Arthur occasionally stopped in the hallway, asked about Elena's arthritic knees, and thanked her for his morning black coffee. Over the years, a quiet, unspoken bond of mutual respect had formed between the old billionaire and the quiet housekeeper. The music swelled as the guests gathered around the base of the staircase for the formal gift presentation. Footmen carried in heavy velvet boxes containing Rolex watches, rare vintage wines, and deeds to properties. Clara stood front and center, playing the dutiful, adoring daughter-in-law, handing Arthur each gift with a theatrical flourish. "Oh, Father," Clara purred, handing him a platinum-encased chronometer from a board member. "Isn't it exquisite? Exactly your taste." Arthur smiled politely, his eyes carrying the weary glaze of a man enduring a performance he had seen 100 times before. "Thank you, Richard. Very generous," he murmured, handing the box to an attendant. As the line of wealthy sycophants began to thin, Elena took a hesitant breath. She stepped out from the shadows of the wainscoting, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She walked slowly toward the base of the stairs, clutching the small, clumsily wrapped package in her palms. Clara turned, her sharp blue eyes instantly locking onto Elena. A look of sheer, unadulterated disgust flashed across Clara's face. She stepped down a few stairs, effectively blocking Elena's path to the patriarch. "Elena," Clara said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness that didn't reach her eyes. "What on earth are you doing out here? The kitchens are that way. If the staff needs instructions, speak to the major domo, not our guests." The surrounding guests turned, murmuring softly. Laughter died down. All eyes shifted to the pathetic figure of the housekeeper standing before the billionaire's family. Elena kept her gaze lowered, showing proper deference, though her spine stiffened. "Begging your pardon, Mrs. Clara, I only wanted to offer a small token of respect to Mr. Sterling. For his birthday." Clara's lips curled into a cruel, mocking smile. She looked at the small brown paper package, then up at Elena, as if inspecting a bug on her shoe. "A token," Clara scoffed, loud enough for the front row of guests to hear. "Good heavens, Elena. Do you seriously think my father-in-law, a man who counts his net worth in commas, wants your charity? What is this? A hand-knitted potholder? A stale scone from the servant's pantry?" A few society women near the front covered their mouths, giggling maliciously. "Clara," Arthur said, his deep, authoritative voice cutting through the murmurs. He stepped past his daughter-in-law, his expression darkening. "Let the woman speak." Clara immediately softened her tone, flashing a radiant, false smile at Arthur. "Oh, father, I'm just saving you the embarrassment. You know how these lower-class people are. They look for any excuse to fish for extra tips or sympathy. You can't possibly accept a dirty little scrap package from a maid. It ruins the aesthetic of the evening." Elena felt a hot flush rise up her neck, but she didn't shrink away. She looked past Clara, meeting Arthur's tired eyes. "It's not much, Mr. Sterling," Elena said softly. "Just something from the heart." Clara's patience snapped. Before Arthur could reach out his hand, Clara snatched the package out of Elena's grasp. "Enough of this peasant theater," Clara hissed, her facade slipping for a split second to reveal pure venom. "If you want to play garbage disposal, Elena, I'll help you out." With a flick of her manicured wrist, Clara whipped her arm back and hurled the small brown paper package across the crowded ballroom. It flew through the air in a clumsy arc, bouncing off a marble pillar with a dull thud, before landing unceremoniously in a large, open decorative urn filled with winter foliage near the exit. Gasps echoed through the room. Clara dusted off her hands as if she had just touched something toxic. "There," Clara smiled, turning back to Arthur. "Now we can get back to celebrating properly. Security will escort you to the servants' quarters later, Elena. Consider yourself lucky you're not fired on spot." Elena stood frozen, a cold tear slipping down her weathered cheek. She didn't care about the insult to herself. She cared about what was inside that package. It was something irreplaceable, something she had spent months sacrificing her meager savings and her few hours of sleep to acquire. She turned on her heel, her head held high despite the humiliation, and began walking toward the exit to retrieve it from the dirt. "Stop," a voice commanded. It wasn't Clara. It was Arthur. The billionaire's voice didn't carry anger. It carried an icy, suffocating dread that instantly froze the room. Arthur was staring not at Clara, but at the decorative urn where the package had landed. His face had completely drained of color, his skin turning a sickly, ghostly gray. The silver glass of champagne he had been holding slipped from his fingers, shattering into 1,000 sparkling shards against the marble floor. Part 2. The Shattered Silence. The sound of shattering glass echoed through the grand ballroom, but no one moved. The air felt heavy, suffocated by an abrupt, chilling tension. Clara blinked, her socialite smile faltering for a fraction of a second as she looked down at the puddle of champagne soaking into her Christian Louboutin heels. Then, she quickly rearranged her features into a mask of tender concern, stepping toward the patriarch. "Oh, father, let me have a footman clean that up," Clara cooed, slipping her arm through his. "You startled yourself. That dreadful woman just had to cause a scene with her little peasant trash. Honestly, security should have locked her in the quarters hours ago." Arthur did not look at her. He didn't even flinch. His eyes remained locked on the large, ornate ceramic urn near the exit, where the faded brown paper package lay half-buried beneath decorative pine cones and dried winter branches. Slowly, deliberately, Arthur pulled his arm away from Clara's grip. The movement was so cold, so devoid of his usual polished warmth, that Clara actually took an instinctive half-step back. "Arthur," she murmured, her voice losing its melodic certainty. "What is it?" Without answering, the billionaire began to walk. The crowd parted instantly, the wealthy elites whispering among themselves, pressing against the mahogany walls to give him a wide berth. His posture, usually rigid and commanding, seemed burdened by an invisible, crushing weight. Every step he took across the polished marble sounded like a hammer blow in the suffocating silence. Elena had already reached the urn. Kneeling on the cold floor, her trembling, calloused fingers dug through the dry foliage until her hand brushed against the frayed silver ribbon. She pulled the package out, cradling it against her black uniform dress, as if it were a fragile newborn. A small tear finally broke free, tracing a clean path down her dust-streaked cheek. She brushed a speck of dirt off the brown paper, her lip quivering. Elena, a deep, trembling voice called out. Elena Froze. She looked up slowly to find Arthur Sterling standing directly over her. The towering, untouchable titan of industry looked down at her, and for the first time in 25 years, she saw absolute, naked vulnerability in his eyes. His lower lip was trembling. Mr. Sterling, Elena stammered, scrambling to her feet in a panic, clutching the package to her chest. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to cause a disruption. I'll take it away. I'll leave the grounds right now. Please don't. Give it to me, Arthur interrupted. His voice was barely a whisper, yet it commanded the entire room with absolute authority. Father, please don't encourage her, Clara snapped, marching over, her heels clicking angrily against the floor. She forced a strained, laughing chuckle, looking around at the guests as if to share in the absurdity of the moment. It's literally garbage. Who knows what germs or cheap trinkets she scavenged from them? Shut your mouth, Clara. Arthur's voice didn't rise in volume, but the venom and ice behind it made Clara recoil as if she had been physically struck. The color rushed out of her face, leaving her jaw hanging open in utter shock. Arthur Sterling had never spoken to her that way. Never, in all the years she had been married to his eldest son. Arthur ignored his daughter-in-law completely, turning his full, undivided attention back to the housekeeper. He slowly extended his aged, trembling hands, palms up. Please, Elena, he repeated, his voice cracking. May I? Elena, her heart pounding against her ribs, nodded slowly. She placed the small, poorly wrapped package into his open palms. Arthur cradled it as though it were made of spun glass. He backed away from Clara and the surrounding crowd, retreating a few paces toward the quiet alcove beneath the grand staircase. The guests craned their necks, desperate to see what kind of absurd object could possibly cause the mighty Arthur Sterling to lose his legendary composure. With agonizing slowness, Arthur hooked a trembling finger under the frayed silver ribbon. He didn't rip the paper like an impatient child opening a luxury birthday present. He uncreased the corners with infinite care, treating every fold like a sacred relic. Clara crossed her arms, tapping her foot on the marble, a smug, venomous smirk returning to her lips. Just wait, she thought to herself. When it turns out to be a cheap plastic keychain or a faded photograph of her own grandchildren, the old man will finally realize what trash we've been harboring, and I'll have her thrown out on the street tonight. The brown butcher paper fell away. Beneath it lay a second layer, a clean, yellowed piece of newspaper dated March 14th, 1974. Arthur's breath hitched. A sharp gasp escaped his lips, and he staggered back half a step, catching himself against the mahogany wainscoting. He peeled back the old newspaper. Inside was a single small object. It wasn't a diamond. It wasn't a gold watch. It wasn't a deed to a property. It was a small, crudely carved wooden horse. The wood was dark walnut, worn smooth by decades of being held in human hands. One of its ears was slightly chipped, and the legs were unevenly whittled, showing the unmistakable, clumsy marks of a pocket knife wielded by an amateur. Silence descended upon the ballroom, a heavy, suffocating silence so deep that the ticking of a grandfather clock in the distant library could be heard. Arthur stared down at the wooden horse. The billionaire's eyes widened, shimmering with a sudden, overwhelming flood of tears. His chest heaved as he fought for air, the memories of a half-century ago crashing over him like a tidal wave. Where? Arthur choked out, his voice barely audible over the ringing in his ears. How did you find this? Part 3. The Ghost of 1974. The ballroom remained frozen in a state of suspended animation. Wealthy socialites, corporate executives, and high society elites stared in stunned silence from the edges of the room, whispering behind cupped hands. None of them could comprehend how a crude, chipped piece of card could reduce a titan of global industry to a weeping wreck. Clara's smug smile had completely vanished, replaced by a twitching, nervous confusion. She stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the marble, trying to regain control of the narrative. "Father, what on earth is that?" Clara asked, her voice tight, trying to inject a light, dismissive laugh that fell flat in the heavy air. "Some kind of primitive knick-knack?" Honestly, Elena, digging through thrift shops to hand off junk on a milestone birthday, is beyond tacky. We should really check if anything else from the estate is missing. She might be a common thief. Elena did not flinch. She kept her head bowed respectfully, but her eyes were fixed on the floor, brimming with silent history. Arthur did not look at Clara. He couldn't. His fingers gently traced the chipped ear of the wooden horse, his hand shaking so violently that the dark walnut toy seemed to vibrate. "Quiet, Clara," Arthur whispered, his voice cracking with an emotion so raw it sent a shudder through the nearest guests. He lifted his gaze from the carving and looked directly at Elena. The fierce, unyielding master of Sterling Enterprises looked like a broken man standing before an altar. It was November of 1974. Arthur began, his voice barely carrying across the vast, high-ceilinged room, yet every single person strained to hear. "I was 24 years old. I had nothing. No money, no company, no future. My wife, my first wife, Sarah, was lying in a freezing charity ward at St. Jude's Hospital, battling an infection after giving birth to our baby girl." A collective murmur rippled through the crowd. Most of the younger guests didn't even know Arthur had been married before. The official corporate biography of the billionaire always began with his second marriage into wealth and his rapid ascent in the 1980s. "We couldn't afford rent," Arthur continued, a tear finally spilling over his wrinkled cheek and dropping onto his polished shoes. "We couldn't afford medicine. I was working 3 different manual labor jobs just to keep us alive for another 24 hours. One night, a bitterly cold night when the snow was piled 6 feet high against our tenement door, our daughter fell terribly sick with a high fever. I had no car. I had no phone. I wrapped her in my only winter coat and ran 3 miles through a blizzard to the county clinic." Arthur's gaze softened as he looked at the quiet housekeeper. "I was sitting in the waiting room," Arthur whispered, tears streaming freely now. "I was sobbing, terrified I was going to lose my little girl because I couldn't afford the $20 for a prescription antibiotic." A young woman, a girl really not much older than 18, sat down on the bench next to me. She didn't have much herself. She was wearing a worn-out coat and carrying a basket of laundry. But she saw me crying. Elena closed her eyes, a soft, melancholy smile touching her lips for a fraction of a second. "She didn't offer me money," Arthur said, his voice breaking into a wet sob. "She reached into her coat pocket, pulled out this exact wooden horse she had carved herself during her breaks at a local furniture workshop, and handed it to me. She said, 'Hold this. A father's hope is the strongest medicine in the world. Your baby is going to make it.'" She told me her name was Elena. And then, before I could even ask her last name or offer to pay her back, the nurses called her name, and she vanished into the back wards. The silence in the grand ballroom grew even deeper, if possible. High society socialites who had spent the evening discussing stock portfolios and luxury yachts stood with their mouths hanging open. Clara's face turned an ugly, mottled shade of pale purple. That night, Arthur continued, his voice swelling with fierce, unbreakable conviction. The doctor filled the prescription for free. My daughter lived. She grew up, went to college, and gave me a life I never dreamed possible. But for 50 years, I searched every registry, every census, every town in this state for the young woman named Elena who gave a desperate, penniless father a reason to keep fighting. Arthur took a shaky step toward the housekeeper, lowering his massive frame until he was looking directly into her tear-filled eyes. "You didn't just give me a birthday gift, Elena," Arthur choked out, his voice thick with eternal gratitude. "You gave me my life back, half a century ago. How? How did you find me? How did you end up here?" Elena finally raised her head, meeting the billionaire's tearful gaze with quiet dignity. "I didn't recognize you at first, Mr. Sterling," Elena said softly, her voice steady and clear. "Not until years after I took the job here as a housekeeper. I saw a framed old newspaper clipping of you in your study. from when your first major company went public in the 80s. I saw your face and I knew. But you were a rich man, surrounded by people who loved your success. I was just the cleaning lady. I didn't want to bother you with the past. I only wanted to give you back your horse, to remind you that no matter how high you climb, you were once just a man who loved his child. Arthur let out a ragged, weeping breath. Without a single second of hesitation, the billionaire dropped his dignity, his pride, and his status on the floor. He fell to his knees on the cold marble, right in front of the housekeeper, and wrapped his arms around her waist, burying his face in the coarse fabric of her black uniform dress, sobbing like a child. Elena gently rested her calloused hand on his silver-haired head, patting his back with the gentle, unconditional tenderness of an old friend. The entire room watched in absolute, stunned disbelief. The wealthiest man in the state was kneeling before Maid. And then, the sound of sharp, furious heels broke the spell. Part 4. The Fall of the Queen. The sharp, staccato sound of high heels shattering the heavy silence felt like a gunshot. Clara Sterling pushed her way through the paralyzed crowd, her face twisted in a mask of absolute, psychotic fury. The socialite glamour had completely evaporated, leaving behind a desperate, cornered predator. She marched right up to the kneeling billionaire and the weeping housekeeper, her chest heaving beneath her custom emerald green gown. "Have you all completely lost your minds?" Clara shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the crystal chandeliers. Several guests instinctively stepped back. "Father, get up off the floor right now," Clara demanded, pointing a manicured, trembling finger down at the patriarch. "You are Arthur Sterling. You built an empire. You are humiliating yourself, our family name, and every single person in this room over some pathetic, sentimental fairy tale told by a glorified cleaning lady." Arthur slowly raised his head from Elena's shoulder. The tears on his face had dried, replaced by an expression so cold, so terrifyingly devoid of human warmth, that Clara froze mid-sentence. It was the look of a ruthless titan who had just decided to annihilate an enemy. He didn't rise immediately. He slowly stood up, brushing his knees, towering over his daughter-in-law with an imposing, glacial presence. "Clara," Arthur said. His voice was no longer trembling. It was a razor blade wrapped in velvet. "Father, I'm just trying to protect your dignity," Clara stammered, taking a nervous step back as the sheer weight of his glare pressed down on her. "Protect my dignity?" Arthur interrupted, his voice cutting through the air like a whip. "You didn't protect my dignity. You displayed a level of cruelty, arrogance, and soulless malice that makes me ashamed to share a last name with you." Clara's face flushed bright red. "She's a servant. She threw garbage at you. I was just. She's the reason I survived long enough to build the company that pays for your designer gowns, your charity galas, and your unearned sense of superiority." Arthur roared, his voice finally breaking with long-suppressed thunder. He pointed a trembling, rigid finger toward the grand front doors. "And more importantly, she's a human being whom you treated like dirt under your feet." Silence gripped the ballroom once more. The elite guests stared at Clara, their expressions shifting from shock to sharp, whispered judgment. Social currency in high society was fickle. The moment a prominent figure fell out of favor, the wolves closed in. "Richard!" Clara screamed, spinning around and looking frantically toward her husband, Arthur's eldest son, who stood near the bar looking like he wished the marble floor would open up and swallow him. "Richard, are you just going to stand there and let your father speak to me this way? Say something." Richard Sterling cleared his throat, pulling his collar away from his neck. He avoided his father's eyes and muttered, Well, Clara, you did throw her gift away. And maybe you were a bit harsh." Clara stared at her husband in utter betrayal. "You coward!" Arthur took a slow step forward, his eyes locked onto his daughter-in-law. The billionaire reached into his tailored suit jacket, pulled out his smartphone, and tapped the screen twice. "Security," Arthur said clearly into the device. Within 3 seconds, 2 massive, suit-clad security guards rushed into the ballroom, posture rigid, ready for a threat. "Sir?" the head of security asked. Arthur pointed directly at Clara. Escort Mrs. Clara Sterling off the premises immediately. Lock all the master suites in the East Wing and prevent her from entering them. Cancel all supplementary corporate credit cards tied to her name and freeze her personal accounts managed by Sterling Enterprises. Gasps erupted through the crowd. Clara's jaw dropped so fast it looked like it might dislocate. You can't do that, Clara shrieked, panic finally piercing her armor. I am a Sterling. I'm on the board of the foundation. You can't just throw me out like trash. Watch me, Arthur said coldly. You have spent the last 10 years treating the staff of this estate and anyone you deemed beneath your social standing with absolute contempt. You thought because you married into my family, you own the world. You own nothing. Father, please, Clara cried out, her voice cracking as the two burly security guards stepped forward, gently but firmly grabbing her by the arms. Get your hands off me. Don't touch me, you peasant pigs. Clara thrashed violently, her designer gown tearing at the seam, her elaborate chignon unraveling as the guards hoisted her up and began dragging her backward toward the grand exit. Richard, do something, you pathetic excuse for a man. I'll ruin you all. I'll sue you for everything you're worth. Her shrieks echoed down the marble hallway, growing fainter and fainter until the heavy front doors swung shut behind her, plunging the grand ballroom into an eerie, echoing quiet. The guests stood frozen, breathing heavily, not daring to make sound. Arthur adjusted the lapels of his jacket. He didn't look at the crowd. Instead, he turned his full attention back to Elena, who was still standing quietly by the base of the staircase, clutching her apron in disbelief. The billionaire walked over to her, his expression softening into a deep, profound reverence. Elena, Arthur said softly, his voice warm and steady. Please, don't ever clean another floor in this house again. Part 5, The New Foundation. The heavy oak doors of Sterling Manor closed shut, shutting out the fading echoes of Clara's hysterical shrieks. The grand ballroom remained shrouded in a profound, almost sacred silence. The high society guests stood frozen, their champagne flutes clutched tightly in their hands, paralyzed by the sudden, brutal demolition of the household hierarchy. Arthur Sterling did not care about the whispers or the sideways glances of the corporate elites. To hell with them. For the first time in 50 years, the invisible knot of guilt and debt that had coiled tightly around his chest was finally unraveling. He stood before Elena, his posture completely unburdened. Mr. Sterling, Elena began, her voice trembling slightly as she clutched the corner of her black maid's uniform. I didn't mean to cause such a storm. Maybe I should just go back to the quarters. Pack my things. Arthur reached out, his warm, aged hand gently resting over her calloused fingers, stopping her from pulling away. Go. Arthur smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that made him look 20 years younger. Elena, you aren't going anywhere. Unless, of course, it's into a much larger, much more comfortable suite on the second floor. Before Elena could process his words, Arthur turned to address the silent crowd of guests and staff hovering in the doorways. Ladies and gentlemen, Arthur's voice boomed across the ballroom, commanding absolute attention. The party is over. Thank you for coming to celebrate my birthday. Please collect your coats on your way out. My staff will ensure your vehicles are brought around. It was a polite, unmistakable dismissal. The wealthy socialites and executives didn't need to be told twice. Eager to escape the toxic fallout of the Sterling family drama, they began murmurs of polite farewells, shuffling quickly toward the exit. Within 10 minutes, the grand marble foyer was entirely cleared of the glittering, fake smiles and designer suits. Only the loyal estate staff remained, standing in a bewildered, quiet semicircle near the kitchens. Arthur turned his attention back to his son, Richard, who still stood awkwardly by the bar, looking like a deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming freight train. Richard, Arthur said coldly. Richard swallowed hard, walking over with his head down. Yes, Dad. Your wife is currently locked out of the East Wing. Her cards are frozen, and by morning, my divorce attorneys will have the separation papers drafted and filed, Arthur stated flatly. You can choose to stand by her and leave this house tonight with nothing, or you can stay, apologize to the woman who literally saved your father's life half a century ago, and help me clean up the mess you both created. Richard didn't hesitate for even a second. He had loved the luxury, but he loved his inheritance more. I'll, I'll handle the divorce paperwork, Dad. She's gone too far. Good. Arthur nodded curtly. Now, get the senior staff into the library. All of them. An hour later, the mahogany-paneled library of Sterling Manor, a room usually reserved for high-stakes corporate mergers and confidential board meetings, was filled with the senior housekeepers, chefs, gardeners, and buttons. They sat in plush leather armchairs, looking deeply uncomfortable, wondering if they were about to be fired en masse. Elena sat in a chair near the fireplace, still clutching the little carved wooden horse as if it were a talisman. Arthur stood at the head of the long oak table. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket anymore. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing aged forearms. I called you all here tonight, not to give you orders, but to issue an apology. Arthur began, his voice thick with sincerity. He looked around the room, making eye contact with every single employee. For years, my home, a home built on the values of hard work and survival, became a place of cruelty. Under my roof, under my blind eye, people who dedicate their lives to keeping this estate running were treated as invisible. That ends tonight. The staff exchanged stunned glances. Arthur turned toward Elena. Effective immediately, Elena is no longer a housekeeper. In fact, she hasn't been a mere employee to me for 50 years. She is my benefactor, my equal, and my dear friend. Elena gasped softly, her eyes widening. Mr. Sterling, please, Quiet, my friend. Let me finish. Arthur chuckled warmly. As of this moment, Elena is appointed as the managing director of the Sterling Philanthropic Foundation and senior estate overseer. She will have full veto power over all administrative decisions regarding staff welfare, working conditions, and household management. Furthermore, 50% of my personal estate holdings and residential assets are hereby transferred into a trust bearing her name. Gasps echoed through the library. The head butler dropped his pen. You can't do that, Arthur, Elena whispered, tears welling in her eyes once more. It's too much. I'm just an old woman who carved a horse. You are the soul of this family, Elena, Arthur said softly, walking over and placing the small wooden horse gently on the mahogany table between them, right next to a golden plaque bearing her new title. You taught me that hope has no price tag, and it's about time I started living by that lesson. The staff began to clap, slowly at first, then with a rising, roaring tide of genuine applause and cheers. Richard even joined in, offering a weak, relieved smile. That night, the storm cleared over Sterling Manor. The cold, artificial luxury that Clara had enforced for a decade was swept away, replaced by something real, enduring, and deeply human. Years later, when people asked the billionaire Arthur Sterling what the secret to his unimaginable wealth and success was, he didn't talk about stocks, real estate, or market trends. He would pull out a small, dark walnut horse with a chipped ear, smile warmly, and say, "A father's hope is the strongest medicine in the world." And never, ever underestimate the quiet